building bridges between China and France and backing the new Silk Road between continents. The French president is on a 3-day visit with trade topping his Chinese agenda. What do the potential deals mean for both Asia and the world? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. It's being described as a new stage in French diplomacy, as well as potential trade deals being signed. President Emmanuel Macron is on his first official visit to China. Economic issues are the focus of the 3-day trip, as well as North Korean nuclear missiles, climate change and investments in Africa. We'll look at those issues in just a moment. Macron has been speaking in the ancient city of Xian.
Il revient à l'Europe et à l'Asie.
It's up to Europe and Asia, to France and China, to define and come up with the rules of a game where we could all win or lose. I have come here to tell China that I am determined to move the Euro-China partnership into the 21st century so that it fits in this new framework that we need to define together. Europe will embrace this new strategy because it is now aware of its role and its place in this century. It will get involved on all of the main topics. Yes, my friends, what I have also come here to say is that Europe is back.
Some of the issues on Macron's agenda are climate change. With President Donald Trump announcing the US is pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, it's a key topic for cooperation between both countries. Also, what's described as the new Silk Road. Macron is backing President Xi's $1 trillion project. The One Belt, One Road initiative aims to extend China's reach across Asia and beyond by using a network of new railways, ports and other infrastructure. And Macron wants to strengthen the French partnership with China, particularly in Africa. Macron says France has the experience of unilateral imperialism in Africa and wants to help China avoid what he calls France's African mistakes. Finally, China and France are both nuclear powers and veto-wielding permanent members of the UN Security Council, so they have much to talk on North Korea, as well as the war in Syria and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So plenty to talk about as well with our panel, and let's bring them in. In Beijing, Ina Tangen, an advisor on economic affairs to the Chinese government. In Singapore, Graham Ong Webb, research fellow at Nanyang Technological University. And in Lille, France, Barthélemy Cormont, director of research at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. Welcome, all of you. Ina, an awful lot is on the agenda here to get through in 3 days. But what's the key thing that China is wanting from France?
Well, it's this a very vocal proponent of the Belt and Road Initiative. This is really something that Xi Jinping has been looking for with Germany right now in not transition, but trying to figure out its government, having Macron step up as a proponent of globalization, wedded to the climate change agenda. This is exactly what they've been looking for.
OK, so Barthélemy, Macron has given this support for the One Belt, One Road initiative. What is it that France now wants in return?
Well, what is interesting is that Macron addressed this issue as early as his first speech after he arrived in Xi'an. And we have to keep in mind that the choice of Xi'an is very significant, very symbolic for the Chinese. I mean, this is where the Silk Roads, in its historical purpose, of course, used to start. So it is a very important location to address the importance of the new Silk Roads and the wish or will of France to join and to do something about it. I mean, we've been expecting a lot from Macron on this issue since he was elected, and this is clearly the first time he does address his desire to cooperate more with China on this issue and try to define together what is exactly the objectives, but also the intentions of China when it comes to the Silk Road.
OK, and what's the key takeaway that Macron wants to take back to Paris from this Chinese visit?
Well, Macron addressed also a very important issue for France at the moment, which is a research of a more multilateral gestion of world affairs. France has been, since Macron's election, very willing to separate a little bit from what we call the Atlantist posture, a posture very linked to the United States, notably under the Obama administration. And of course, the election of Donald Trump in the US totally changed this paradigm, as well as the Brexit in the United Kingdom. And Macron has repeatedly mentioned his intention to adopt a more, we call it in France, a more Gaullist Mitterrandian posture that refers, of course, to the late presidents Charles de Gaulle and François Mitterrand. And this posture is based on a more independent research of implications of great powers, not constantly linked to our Atlantic allies. And Macron addressed again this particular message during his speech in Xian, which is very interesting. So he called China for a bigger involvement in world affairs, but also a bigger partnership on world issues such as terrorism, such as Syria, such as North Korea, such as, of course, also global warming.
Graham, we've got two leaders here with very big ambitions. With the US in retreat, as Barthélemy just mentioned, is global dominance on their minds?
Clearly, I mean, a global dominance is a theme that is continually discussed in light of the shake-up that we've seen in global politics over the last 12 months in the least. And whoever is going to step up to the fore will want to come up with an arrangement that will benefit not just themselves but the international community, taking into account how highly integrated the global economy really is. And I think this is part of the messaging that we will see unfold in the discussions over the next few days, that China is being reminded not to just look at itself, but to look at the rest of the world and how what it does has huge impact across the Asia-Pacific region and the rest of the world. And I think this is a very welcome moment in terms of this meeting, in having China being invited, if you like, to step forward and play a constructive role as possible that can benefit everyone.
And one area where we can particularly see this is Africa. I know we've got France warning China not to make the same mistakes it did on that continent during colonial times. Is this a message that China hears and will respond to?
Well, I don't know how they'll officially respond to it, but having a willing partner on both sides is very, very important. China obviously has the money. They have a vision for the Belt and Road Initiative. And France is very connected to its former colonial empire, and it wants to maintain those ties. But it doesn't necessarily have the wherewithal to put in the kind of infrastructure and investment that is needed. So forming a partnership seems very, very logical. It's a win-win situation. It's not the zero-sum game that you have in Trump's view of the world. But in terms of what what China sees France as one is, they want a willing partner in Africa, which we just discussed. They're also looking for some bolstering. It's not only that Macron is talking about doing more with China. He wants the EU to play a more central role. And with China recognizing his, let us say, gravitas at this stage, it will help him as he goes back to the EU and says, listen, we either adopt the protectionist view of the United States and we retreat and give up the values that we've had through globalization, or we go forward and we forward something much more clear with China. So I would disagree that this is somehow taking China to task or inviting them. This is a multipolar world, and I think China recognizes that, and that's why there's going to be quite a bit of give and take.
Okay, do the Chinese see Macron as the new leader of Europe, with, of course, Brexit taking the UK out of the picture a little bit and Merkel focused on domestic affairs?
Well, I don't necessarily know that they see him as the sole leader. They see it for what it is. He cannot do anything without Germany. So therefore, there's going to have to be consensus. But he's the first mover. As Merkel, as you said, is confined to figuring out how her government is going to look, if she can put it together. He's the one who stepped forward, and I think that will be to his advantage. And we'll see that in the number of deals that he's able to bring to the table and take back to France.
Okay. Barthélemy, it's not all roses and light, isn't it? Because we've also heard Macron calling for a stronger Europe to, quote, face China and the US. So should Beijing feel a little bit threatened?
I don't think he will feel any frightened about that, but I totally agree with what has been said previously regarding the importance of the EU in Macron's visit to China. And I think that Macron acknowledges that, but also Xi Jinping acknowledges that. And for the Chinese leaders at the moment, Macron is perceived as what we may call the head of European diplomacy. I mean, if we may put a word to it. Macron is in a position that no European leader has at the moment. Angela Merkel is facing some domestic political problems, and she doesn't have the same attributes of power that you have mentioned earlier, a seat at the UN Security Council, nuclear power, and the capacity to send forces abroad. These are attributes that France has. The UK also does, but as we know, the UK is a little bit out at the moment. So in the eyes of the Chinese, France is playing a more significant role, not only in world affairs, but especially in shaping some sort of European defense and foreign policy. And Macron is incarnating it. So therefore, this visit is not just about French-Chinese relations. It's far more important and ambitious than that. It's about the new Silk Roads, we have mentioned that. It's also about China-EU relations and its future. So that's why this visit is, I think, far more important than Angela Merkel's last trip to Beijing, for instance.
Okay. If we are seeing a partnership forged between Xi and Macron, Graham, how different are they in their views when it comes to global governance? I mean, how are these men going to get on and work together?
Mm-hmm. Well,
coming back to my point about the invitation, this is exactly it. I think Macron is clearly aware that at this moment in global affairs, the last thing you want to do is to push China away at a time when a lot of middle and major powers are on the retreat, or the perception that there's an ongoing retreat. And to have China come into this conversation and to play its part, and presumably also perhaps to be more open to China's ways of doing of global conduct as well. I think this is going to be a two-way conversation, and I think the allusion is quite clear, even in terms of Macron's reference to the Silk Road being a two-way street, essentially, not just in physical terms, but in conversational terms as well, for China to be more open to the ways of established global governance and regulatory undertakings, and vice versa for the EU and other economic blocs to be open to China's own way of doing things as well. And I think this is the kind of partnership we're going to see going forward, and not just in terms of just China and France. And I take Bartholomew's point. I think this is a much larger conversation about Asia and Europe as well, as both blocs work more closely together in sort of a win-win arrangement, because each one has something the other lacks. The EU has a pile of experience and resources, and of course there are markets abound in Asia to be tapped into on the Asian side of the house. So I think this is going to be a win-win situation, as I mentioned.
Okay, just to follow on that similar vein of thought, Einar, I mean, most Western leaders, when they go to China, are pressured to hold China to account for its human rights records. Will we see Macron doing that with China, or is that going to be pushed to the side in favour of this new partnership?
Well, actually, we'll never know, because his office has already announced that any kind of talk about human rights will be in private. Right. And so there will be no report on it. In terms of how Macron is looking at this, I mean, he's in a difficult position. You know, the book Fire and Fury coming out as this meeting comes about. The world is facing very, very strong questions about what exactly the U.S. direction is and what is Trump's role in it. So you find yourself with very, very few partners. The EU needs markets. China is a massive market. He's trying to figure out how to do it. Look for him to be pressing on issues like opening up finance services, for French banks in China. They already have the first one. A license was granted to a French bank to start operating in China. I think you'll see this being pushed. This has been carefully orchestrated and been in the works for a long time. But this latest revelation from this book, even if only 50% were true, is quite disturbing and will obviously give pause to both sides as they try to figure out what shape the world they want should be.
Okay, I mean, one key issue facing the entire world is global warming. We know that Macron has positioned himself to be the leader to take forward the Paris Accords, especially after Donald Trump announcing that the US will pull out of that. Barthélemy, how keen is he to get China's renewed commitment to those agreements?
Well, the problem with China when it comes to facing global warming is the gap between the intentions and the reality. And we expect some significant moves from China. And of course, any move will be welcome considering the importance of China on such issues. So Macron is bringing a message which is quite clear. We need you. We need China on this particular topic. And we are therefore somehow following what are your intentions, and we are looking at how you transform it into some sort of reality. So that's a very important issue. But on top of that, I would like to come back to what matters a little bit when it comes to the perceptions between the two countries, and more broadly, the Europeans on one side and the Chinese on the other. There are some fears in Europe nowadays regarding China's intentions, China's power, and of course, the nature of Chinese regime. And therefore, Macron must address such issues. He cannot, of course, talk clearly about human rights because we know that he will face a lot of critics, and we know that, unfortunately, he will be extremely controversial. But he already did that in his speech in Xian. He mentioned the fact that the New Silk Road initiative, for instance, is subject to a lot of attention, but also a lot of questions in the world, and especially in Europe. And therefore, China is invited to clarify its intentions. And I think this is extremely important. Clarification of China on global warming, on the New Silk Road, but also more generally on its involvement in world affairs. This is really what Macron expects from these exchanges with the Chinese leaders over the next few days.
Graham, I can see you nodding your head there. You agree then that China does need to be more transparent?
Yes, very much so. And it takes a highly respected major power like France to tell China that, and for China to listen, deliberate on that point, and to make a response. And I think this is very welcome in the Asia-Pacific, because it's not just France or the rest of the EU or the rest of the world really that's concerned about the future of China, but very much so here in our backyard in the Asia-Pacific, in Southeast Asia, we have very similar questions. There's a lot of hope about what China can do in terms of lifting all boats in the region, if you like, but there's also a lot of questions about China's strategic intentions, especially with the protracted issue of the South China Sea dispute, which is still ongoing, even though it's a slow burn issue. And with France in the picture, it's actually a very welcome respite, because France is lifting that conversation up and holding China to account, if you like, in a sense, saying that there are certain rules of the game that one ought to abide by, and you would be more respected for it. And this is part of an ongoing approach, which I think is extremely constructive, about socializing and engaging China at a time when we have the current US administration or the previous US administration containing China, which is extremely unhelpful.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't heard from President Xi as of Monday evening when we're recording this programme during this visit from Macron. But Ina, do you think we're going to see him giving some indications that China will be open and transparent and show its intentions, that it's going to react well to any French pressure on this matter?
Well, quite frankly, the days when colonial powers can lecture China, I think, are over, and I would respectfully disagree with my colleagues on that particular issue. China is the one who is spending the most on environmental protection. They're the ones who said to their provincial and city leaders, your environmental record will follow you for the rest of your life. They've criminalized it. I don't know how much more you could do to show that you're very serious about tackling pollution. It was one of the three major issues.
Sorry to interrupt, but what about other issues like this new Silk Road and its intentions in Africa? What about those issues?
Those are very important issues and yet to be decided. How the partnership could work in Africa. It's going to center around this issue of fighting terrorism. In terms of the Silk Road, China cannot do this alone. The $1 trillion number is far short of what is needed. China has taken a very bold step and said we will be the first, but they need other countries. And to that extent, yes, they're looking for partners. They're not looking to dictate. They're trying to set an example of the new world order, which is not about one country dominating other countries, but simply working together for the collective good. In other words, globalization 2.0.
Okay, so Barthélemy, how far then can this relationship go if China is not willing to play by any rules that Macron might want to impose?
I think it's in China's interest to play the roles. I haven't seen in Xi Jinping's posture since he became the leader of China any sign of protectionism or will to be more seeking some sort of isolation. China is more and more engaged in a lot of issues. And I do agree with China's efforts on the global warming issues. I mean, China is indeed doing a lot of efforts, but we also know that China must do a lot of efforts. So that's why we are, of course, paying a lot of attention to the results. But anyway, yes, China, I believe, is carefully listening to the advices, but also to the possibilities for partnerships with partners like France. And I believe that for the Chinese, this visit is extremely important. It reshapes somehow the relation between the EU and China that unfortunately has been a little bit shaking in the past, let's say, 2 decades. So this is something very important to rebuild, especially considering the international context that we have, all of us described in details. And in this purpose, I believe that Macron's visit and the timing of this visit is considered in China as some sort of opportunity to show what I may call a new face for the international community, a face of a country more willing to cooperate, to participate, to engage itself also. Okay.
Graham, just lastly, Macron has pledged to visit China every year of his presidency. I mean, that's a pretty big deal, isn't it? This is a relationship that we're going to want to keep an eye on.
Certainly, and I think Macron has clearly understands the importance of saying that and following through with that going forward. The issue of face is a very important principle or concept in Asian culture, and the more face-to-face meetings, the better, and on a regular basis at that. And I think China is very welcoming of that overture, and it's only going to cement relations between these two powers going forward, and it's going to really consolidate a new bridge at a time when there's just so much fluidity going on in terms of the power politics of the global system.
Okay, well, keep an eye on it. We certainly will. Many thanks to all our guests for joining us here today. Aina Tangen there in Beijing, Graham Ong Webb in Singapore, and Barthélemy Cormont in Lille. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go and visit our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.